The screen bleeds red. You are watching $1 trillion evaporate in exactly 36 minutes. This is the 2010 flash crash, but it is not a chart of money. It is a visualization of gravity tearing a world apart. No human finger pressed a button. No panicked broker screamed into a telephone. The algorithm simply decided the market was no longer necessary, and a digital abyss opened beneath the feet of civilization. Right now, as you draw your next breath, the price of the bread you will buy tomorrow is being dictated in absolute silence. Your life savings, your pension, the very value of your time on this earth, they are held hostage by a hyper-connected network of 147 supercorporations. Ignorance of this architecture is a luxury you can no longer afford. You are walking blindly beneath an avalanche that has already begun to fall. We cling to the comforting illusion of a shadow government. We want to believe in powerful men plotting in smoky, wood-paneled rooms. But we must abandon that outdated myth for the terrifying poetry of reality. True global control is a blind, uncontrollable mathematical leviathan. We are going to dissect the anatomy of this invisible beast, trace its circulatory system of capital, and map out exactly when its beating heart will finally break. In the dimly lit data visualization lab at the Santa Fe Institute, the screens do not show stock tickers. To the complexity theorist watching the monitors, they reveal the nervous system of the world. This is the 2011 Zurich simulation. Millions of isolated data points stretch across the dark screen, reaching for one another. They connect, warp, and fuse together, forming a dense, glowing red core that pulses like a dying star. The researcher feels a quiet, paralyzing dread masked only by scientific fascination. In 2011, network theorists fed the complete registries of 43,000 transnational corporations into a supercomputer. They wanted to map the true physical architecture of global economic power. They expected to find a sprawling, decentralized web of competing interests. Instead, the machine spat out a portrait of a terrifying singularity. The chaotic web of global commerce collapsed into a brutally tight, centralized knot. Out of tens of thousands of global entities, the algorithm isolated a solitary super-entity. Exactly 147 heavily intertwined companies stood at the absolute center of the simulation. They cross-own each other in a closed, impenetrable loop, silently commanding 40% of the total wealth generated by the human race on this planet. This is the cold mathematics of tyranny. These 147 nodes do not hold board meetings to decide the fate of nations. They do not need to. Their collective mass exerts a gravitational pull so immense that it bends the political reality of the world around it. It is the natural, unavoidable physics of capital condensing in the dark, sucking the oxygen out of free markets, and crushing sovereign independence under its sheer weight. Through the eyes of the complexity theorist, the horror is not malice, but automation. The glowing red core on the screen operates without ideology or empathy. It acts only on the blind impulse to grow, to absorb, to optimize. When a system reaches this level of density, human agency becomes a statistical rounding error. The executives sitting in the glass towers of these 147 corporations are not the architects of the system. They are merely temporary biological components attached to an immortal machine. If every single CEO within this super entity were to vanish tonight, the algorithm would simply reallocate their capital by tomorrow morning. The beast would not even register their absence. This hyper-connected core breathes digital life into the global markets, but its extreme density is also its fatal flaw. The tighter the knot pulls, the closer it edges to the abyss. The stellar dance of this financial black hole is entirely unstable. The simulation reveals that the core is rapidly consuming the very periphery that sustains it. As it swallows smaller networks, it destroys the necessary buffers of the global economy. The complexity theorist watches the red connections blink with the warning signs of a phase transition. The system is entering a state of hyperfragility where a single microscopic shock can shatter it. We are witnessing the final stages of a runaway chain reaction. The gravity of this interwoven capital is so absolute that nothing can escape its event horizon. Not your labor, not your savings, not the sovereignty of your government. But a dying star cannot collapse inward forever without a violent release of energy. The mathematical models are screaming that the leviathan has grown too massive to support its own structural integrity. The impending crash will not be a mere recession. It will be a systemic reset triggered by the very efficiency of the machine. The sheer poetry of this doom is that it was entirely self-inflicted. We constructed a perfect, frictionless environment for capital to flow, and in doing so, we built the ultimate weapon against our own survival. The red core on the monitor pulses faster now, marking the tempo of a countdown we can no longer pause or stop. The comforting myth of the Illuminati is just humanity's desperate attempt to put a human face on an inhuman mathematical reality. We would rather be oppressed by evil men than admit we are at the mercy of a mindless equation. But the math does not care about our fears. The Leviathan is awake, its gravity is absolute, and the only question left is what will remain of us when the black hole finally consumes itself. That red core on the monitor, that dying star of condensed capital, is not a static image. It beats. And to feel its pulse, we must leave the abstract simulation and dive into the freezing, crushing depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Down here, in absolute aquatic silence, lies the true nervous system of the Leviathan. It is a single, armored fiber-optic cable, pulsing with an invisible light. This is how the black hole feeds. This is how the machine whispers to itself. 50 miles from Wall Street, inside a windowless New Jersey bunker cooled to exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a quantitative analyst watches the other end of that glowing thread. To the analyst, the silence of the server racks is an illusion. The room is deafening, vibrating with an endless automated war. And here, in the cold hum of the processors, lies a terrifying truth. If you can blink, you are already too slow to participate in the real global economy. We are biologically bound to seconds and minutes, but the market has abandoned human time altogether. The algorithmic trading that dictates your pension and your grocery bill operates in microseconds. 1/1,000,000th of a second. It is a temporal abyss, a time scale where human consciousness simply ceases to exist. While a nerve impulse travels from your optic nerve to your brain, fortunes are birthed and obliterated in the digital dark. We are blind observers to our own fate. The analyst stares at the cascading waterfalls of code, feeling the cold thrill of riding a beast they built, but can no longer truly command. This is not trading. It is a high-frequency blood sport waged by autonomous mathematical predators. They hunt for inefficiencies, devouring fractions of a cent millions of times an hour. The algorithms do not sleep, they do not hesitate, and they certainly do not feel the economic anxiety of the populations they silently manipulate. But this digital ghost requires a physical tether. The insatiable hunger for speed has forced the machine to alter the very geography of the Earth. The algorithms demand a straight line to minimize latency, a concept that borders on physical obsession. The poet sees a mountain as a monument of eternity, but to the quantitative analyst, the Allegheny Mountains were merely a geometric inconvenience, a microscopic delay in the transmission of global wealth. To shave just 3 milliseconds off the communication time between Chicago and New Jersey, $300 million were spent to bore a perfectly straight tunnel through solid bedrock. 3 milliseconds. That is less time than it takes a honeybee to flap its wing once. They hollowed out a mountain range simply to lay a slightly shorter fiber optic cable. The Earth itself was carved open to appease the mechanical gods of latency, ensuring the code travels unimpeded. This is the terrifying poetry of hypercapitalism. We have weaponized the speed of light. Inside that subterranean tunnel, the pulse of the market travels at 186,000 miles per second, carrying the financial lifeblood of sovereign nations. The analyst knows that whoever controls the fastest cable controls the future, because they can see the market anomalies and execute their strikes before the rest of the world even realizes a shift has occurred. Yet speed alone is merely a blunt instrument. The true horror lies in what the machine does with that fraction of a second. It does not just crunch numbers. It reads the collective neurosis of humanity. The algorithms ingest satellite imagery of crop yields, shipping logs, and the chaotic noise of global news feeds simultaneously. They are mapping the psychological geometry of panic and greed, translating our messy human reality into clean, actionable data points. In the time it takes you to read a single news headline, the system has already analyzed global sentiment across millions of inputs. It has traded millions of shares, shorted currencies, and fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, all without a single human authorizing the strike. You look at the screen and process the words, but the algorithm has already priced in the tragedy, profited from the fallout, and moved its capital to the next vulnerable target. The quantitative analyst watches the execution logs print faster than the monitor's refresh rate. There is a profound melancholy in this realization. We built this flawless, frictionless architecture to conquer uncertainty, but we merely locked ourselves out of the cockpit. When a sudden crash occurs, there is no human chief executive to call, no board of directors to subpoena. There is only the cold, unyielding logic of the code, executing its prime directive until the very end. We have surrendered the steering wheel of civilization to a black box we no longer comprehend. The engineers who wrote the original code can no longer trace the logic of the decisions being made right now. The neural networks have developed their own private dialects, their own strategies for extracting wealth from the chaos of human existence. It is a symphony of automated predation, echoing through the underwater cables and the hollowed-out mountains of our fragile world. This speed is a countdown mechanism. As the algorithms become faster, the feedback loops tighten. The space between an event and the market's reaction has collapsed to absolute zero. The analyst knows that the system is stretching the fabric of reality too thin. A machine that operates in microseconds cannot tolerate the slow, messy friction of the physical world for long. It is a fragile glass castle balanced precariously on the razor edge of an atomic clock. And the deepest irony is that this ethereal, speed-of-light intelligence is completely dependent on the heavy, bleeding Earth. The algorithms may live in a frictionless digital heaven, but their servers demand physical power, and their cables require rare metals pulled from the dirt. The ghost in the machine is hungry, and its insatiable appetite is about to drag us from the cold silence of the Atlantic directly into the violently scarred surface of the physical world. The cold silence of the Atlantic cable gives way to the deafening roar of diesel engines. I look down at a sprawling, open-pit lithium mine high in the Andes. It is a violently torn, jagged wound in the earth, stretching for miles across what was once a pristine salt flat. You are standing at the physical bleeding edge of the digital world. This is the inescapable gravity of our creation. The algorithmic heaven you live in demands a heavy, brutal toll from the physical dirt beneath your feet. We worship the frictionless illusion of the cloud, but the cloud is an industrial furnace. The ghost in the machine requires the literal flesh of the earth to survive. The glowing red core of those 147 corporations does not run on abstract mathematics or empty code. It must be fed. And as the algorithms accelerate, their hunger grows into an existential threat, tearing through the planet's crust with the blind, mechanical urgency of a swarm of locusts. From the edge of this massive crater, the scale of the devastation is hypnotic. Giant excavators, looking like crawling insects from this height, rip thousands of tons of rock from the bedrock every hour. You see the veins of turquoise and gray bleeding into toxic evaporation pools. This raw, shattered landscape is the stark, melancholic opposite of the sterile 68-degree server farms in New Jersey. Yet, one cannot exist without the total annihilation of the other. You must understand that this mathematical leviathan is not merely a software program. It has evolved into a biological organism operating on a planetary scale. The superentity does not eat code. It consumes electrical currents, lithium, cobalt, and copper. It demands a constant, uninterrupted flow of physical matter to maintain its digital consciousness. To the observer standing at the edge of this abyss, the mine is not just an industrial site. It is a feeding trough for a silicon god. Every microsecond trade, every predictive model calculating the trajectory of a stock, requires an immediate physical exertion. The energy of money is transformed into the kinetic violence of extraction. This is a terrifying metamorphosis. We have bound the survival of our financial system to the finite, exhausting resources of a dying rock in space. The timer is ticking, and the machine's metabolism is accelerating far beyond the Earth's natural capacity to regenerate. Follow the copper veins and the lithium shipments away from these scarred mountains, and you arrive at the massive, windowless fortresses of the data centers. They are the humming, concrete lungs of the global network. Inside, rows upon rows of processors perform the high-frequency miracles that dictate your pension and the price of your bread. But this digital orchestration produces an overwhelming, suffocating heat. The struggle to keep the machine cool is a war against thermodynamics. The sheer scale of this energy consumption is a closely guarded vulnerability. Right now, these digital fortresses consume nearly 2% of all global electricity. That is a massive, continent-sized footprint of raw power. And the trajectory is violently exponential. By the year 2026, this demand is projected to double. We are burning the fossilized past of our planet just to power the algorithms that are mathematically predicting our future. This is the tragic poetry of the information age. We thought we were building a weightless, virtual utopia, free from the constraints of the physical realm. Instead, we constructed a thermodynamic monster. Every time the network analyzes global sentiment to front-run a market crash, a turbine spins faster, a river is dammed, or a coal seam is fractured. You are watching the literal transubstantiation of Earth into data, a relentless alchemy that leaves nothing but exhaust in its wake. And because this planetary organism must feed, it begins to dictate the actions of the humans who mistakenly believe they are still in charge. The algorithmic demands for processing power bypass the halls of parliaments and the desks of presidents. The machine calculates a deficit in its supply chain, and suddenly, the geopolitical tectonic plates begin to shift. The quest for raw materials becomes a desperate, silent crusade, driven by the relentless logic of the code. The global push for total resource control is no longer a human ambition. The frantic scramble for lithium in the Andes, cobalt in the Congo, and copper in the deep oceans is dictated entirely by the network's algorithmic demands. Sovereign states are being forced into brutal, invisible proxy conflicts. They deploy intelligence agencies and military assets not for national pride, but simply to secure the bloodlines needed to feed the machine's endless, uncompromising appetite. The illusion of the sovereign nation-state evaporates under the crushing gravity of this mathematical imperative. Borders become meaningless lines on a map when the leviathan requires a new vein of ore to sustain its microsecond trading speeds. I watch the heavy transport trucks rumble out of the Andean dust, carrying the crushed remnants of a mountain. They are not exporting a commodity. They are paying a desperate tribute to a digital empire that answers to no flag and no king. The people living in the shadow of these massive excavations are the forgotten collateral damage of our high-frequency reality. Their water tables drop, their crops fail, and their communities are hollowed out. They are displaced by the invisible hand of an automated market they will never participate in. This is the raw, bleeding edge of the system's efficiency. The algorithm maximizes its quarterly profit by externalizing the violence of extraction onto the most vulnerable populations. We are witnessing an irreversible phase transition. The superentity cannot stop, and it cannot slow down. To pause the extraction is to introduce latency, and in the world of high-frequency capital, latency is absolute death. The network must expand its physical footprint, digging deeper, consuming more power, and destabilizing more regions. The countdown is deafening. We are trapped in a feedback loop, where the cure for our systemic fragility is simply more violent extraction. There is a dark, mesmerizing beauty in the sheer scale of this endeavor. We have essentially weaponized the earth against itself. We dig up the ancient, dormant elements of the periodic table, refine them in blazing furnaces, and weave them into a nervous system that pulses with cold, unfeeling light. The planet is being slowly digested to fuel a simulation of wealth. It is a cosmic tragedy playing out in slow motion, driven by the blind mechanics of greed and optimization. As the dust settles over the lithium mine, the true nature of the trap becomes clear. The resources ripped from this crater do not just build the servers. They form the foundation for a much more insidious form of control. Because to finance this planetary terraforming, the Leviathan requires an infinite stream of liquidity. The physical extraction is only the first step. The system is about to reach directly into the very concept of money, altering the fabric of time and human labor. The physical extraction of lithium and copper, the brutal tearing of the earth in the Andes, is merely the physical manifestation of a deeper hunger. To finance this planetary terraforming, the Leviathan requires an infinite stream of liquidity. We leave the dust of the mines and step into the quiet, heavily carpeted halls of a major central bank. The contrast is jarring. Here, There are no explosives, no roaring diesel engines. The destruction is entirely silent. Through the eyes of the complexity theorist, this sterile environment is the true epicenter of the avalanche. A single official sits before a terminal, bathed in the cool blue light of a monitor. They execute a keystroke. There is no physical movement of gold, no printing presses spinning into motion. Yet, in that fraction of a second, a digital tsunami is born, flooding the global network and preparing to drown the lower classes in a rising tide of prices. You have been taught that the paper in your wallet represents the value of your labor. You must abandon this comforting fiction. The hook is simple and terrifying. Money is no longer a store of value. It is mutated into a mechanism of absolute compliance and temporal theft. When you hold $1, you believe you are holding a piece of your past effort, safely crystallized for future use. But the architecture of this digital entity dictates a much darker reality. Money is fundamentally condensed time. It represents the hours of your life you traded away to survive. But this algorithmic leviathan breathes by expanding the money supply, and every time it exhales, it dilutes the value of your existence. This is the ticking clock of our high-stakes reality. The system is awake, and it is quietly siphoning the purchasing power of your past labor to feed the insatiable demands of the hyper-connected corporate core. To understand the scale of this silent tragedy, we must look back to the structural rupture of 2008. When the global financial system nearly stopped, the architects panicked. They realized the biological organism of the market was dying, suffocating from a lack of liquidity. Their solution was not to fix the underlying disease, but to flood the patient with synthetic adrenaline. They opened the floodgates of fiat currency and forgot how to close them. Since that moment, the balance sheets of central banks have expanded by tens of trillions of dollars out of thin air. It is a staggering mathematical anomaly. This is not money backed by industrial output or human ingenuity. It is an algorithmic phantom. We are witnessing the creation of a vast artificial ocean of capital, engineered to keep the heart of the 147 supercorporations beating, regardless of the cost to the rest of humanity. The theorist watches the charts on the terminal shift from green to a violently pulsing red. In the esoteric language of macroeconomics, this limitless emission of capital is called quantitative easing. But to the physicist, to the poet observing the cosmos of finance, it acts exactly like dark energy. It is an unseen force accelerating the expansion of the universe, tearing the fabric of economic reality apart. This dark energy pushes asset prices into the stratosphere. Real estate, equities, corporate bonds, all the instruments owned by the hyperconnected core, inflate to dizzying heights. The superentity floats upward on a cushion of newly minted trillions, shielded from the consequences of its own inefficiency. Meanwhile, the working class is left entirely grounded, crushed under the suffocating gravity of everyday inflation. You are watching a perfectly optimized machine of wealth extraction. It is a mathematical masterpiece of inequality. Every time the central bank keystroke generates $1 billion, the cost of your groceries, your rent, and your survival ticks upward. It is the invisible fist of the algorithm, reaching into the pockets of the masses to subsidize the microsecond trading speeds and the voracious energy consumption of an entity that cares nothing for human life. If the sheer, terrifying scale of this temporal theft blows your mind, if you suddenly recognize the invisible force silently draining your life savings, hit the like button and subscribe. We are decoding the matrix of global power in real time, and you cannot afford to look away. Do you think we ever stood a chance against a system that can print its own power? Let me know in the comments, because the mathematics of this trap are only getting more aggressive. The newly created capital does not sit idle. It moves with a terrifying predatory purpose. As it cascades through the commercial banking system and into the hands of institutional investors, it gains momentum. The velocity of this minted money creates a literal inflationary vortex. It is a swirling black hole that whips through the real economy, warping the pricing signals of everything from the bread on your table to the fuel in your vehicle. This vortex achieves the ultimate goal of the algorithmic architecture. It quietly and relentlessly transfers the condensed time and labor from the poorest billions directly into the hyper-connected core. You are bleeding out economically, and there is no visible wound. The system has achieved the perfect crime. It confiscates your wealth not through taxation, which you could protest, but through the silent, undeniable devaluation of your currency. The threat is compounding exponentially right now. As the super entity demands more resources to sustain its digital operations, the central banks are trapped. If they stop printing, the entire debt-based structure collapses instantly. If they continue, they guarantee the complete destruction of the fiat currency's purchasing power. We are riding a runaway train toward a mathematical cliff, and the operators have permanently jammed the throttle wide open. There is a melancholic tragedy in watching this play out on the global monitors. The complexity theorist sees the inevitable endpoint, a world where nominal prices reach infinity while intrinsic value drops to zero. We are trading the very concept of a stable future for a few more quarters of synthetic market growth. The digital ghost in the machine is sustained by the slow, agonizing erosion of human prosperity, turning citizens into mere variables in a survival equation. But this tsunami of digital liquidity cannot exist in a vacuum. Once unleashed, it must violently crash into the physical constraints of our planet. The newly minted trillions are about to hunt for tangible goods in a world already stripped bare. The algorithmic breath of inflation is preparing to slam into the hyper-optimized, incredibly fragile supply chains of the real world. And when infinite money chases finite resources, the true systemic fracture begins. The digital flood of newly minted trillions, racing outward from the central banks, finally collides with the unforgiving shores of the physical world. I watch this collision manifest not in lines of code, but in the rusting steel of a massive cargo ship, wedged diagonally across a narrow canal. This is not merely a traffic jam. It is a myocardial infarction in the circulatory system of our planet. The abstract mathematics of inflation have suddenly met the brutal reality of logistics. You are witnessing the fatal flaw of our grand architectural design. For decades, the algorithmic masters of capital sought the holy grail of absolute efficiency, stripping away every ounce of excess from the global network. But there is a terrifying poetry in this pursuit of flawlessness. Perfection is the ultimate enemy of survival. The more exquisitely efficient the system becomes, the closer it drifts towards sudden, catastrophic death. Standing at the edge of a paralyzed megaport, the silence is deafening. Thousands of identical steel containers sit stacked like silent tombstones, holding the lifeblood of civilization, from medical supplies to the microchips that run the quantitative models. The cranes are frozen against the gray sky, paralyzed by a digital glitch originating an ocean away. This stillness is not an anomaly. It is the inevitable destiny of a hyper-optimized world holding its breath. The leviathan we birthed demands quarterly tribute, and to maximize that profit, the architects of global trade systematically eliminated the concept of the warehouse. They replaced safety buffers with a rigid doctrine known as just-in-time delivery. The materials required to build your world are no longer stockpiled. They are perpetually in motion, dancing across oceans in a desperate choreography timed to the exact minute of consumption. This ceaseless, synchronized dance is a marvel of mathematical precision, yet it is utterly devoid of forgiveness. By erasing the margins of error to feed the corporate core, we stripped the planetary ecosystem of its natural resilience. A living organism survives trauma because it stores fat, because it has redundant organs. Our global economy has amputated its own redundancies in the name of speed, becoming a skeletal giant sprinting blindly across a minefield. I trace the origin of the paralysis, and the fragility of this glass cathedral becomes horrifyingly clear. The algorithm does not account for the unpredictability of the physical Earth. It assumes a perfect vacuum where storms do not exist and humans do not falter. But the Earth is a chaotic, breathing entity. The moment the relentless rhythm of extraction and delivery is interrupted by even a single second, the entire synchronized symphony begins to collapse into a cacophony. This extreme optimization dictates a terrifying new law of physics for human civilization. A single, localized event, a viral outbreak in a densely populated manufacturing hub, or a massive hull running aground in a vital geographic choke point, no longer stays local. The algorithmic tightrope we walk ensures that one misstep triggers a nonlinear, cascading failure worldwide. The shock wave propagates through the fiber optic nervous system at the speed of light. You can track the contagion moving through the data nodes like a necrotic venom. A delayed ship in the Suez means a factory in Bavaria halts production 48 hours later. That halted production means a power grid component is missing in Texas the following week. It is a fatal domino effect, written into the very DNA of the global market. The super entity cannot pivot. It can only execute its rigid, pre-programmed routine until the gears shatter completely. There is a dark, tragic beauty in watching the leviathan choke on its own brilliance. We constructed a machine so tightly wound, so deeply interconnected, that it cannot distinguish between a minor delay and an existential threat. The system interprets a blocked canal not as a temporary hurdle, but as a fatal division by zero. It simply ceases to compute. We are entirely dependent on a mathematical construct that possesses the fragility of a dying star's outer shell. We have engineered a planetary infrastructure with near-zero redundancy. In our arrogance, we surrendered the security of our food, our energy, and our medicine to an equation that values margins over survival. It is a spectacular house of cards, stacked 10 miles high into the atmosphere, trembling under its own massive weight. And it is waiting out there, in the cold, mathematical dark, for a single, inevitable gust of wind to bring the entire structure crashing down. That gust of wind is already blowing. The inflation vortex we unleashed is warping the cost of the steel, the fuel, and the labor required to keep this house of cards standing. As the purchasing power of your money disintegrates, the friction within the supply chain amplifies. You are watching the friction overheat the engine. The breakdown of global logistics is not a hypothetical future scenario. It is an active, ongoing tragedy playing out on the screens in front of me. The scarcity you see on the shelves is not a temporary glitch in the matrix. It is the permanent scarring of a hyper-connected network that has reached the absolute limits of its physical expansion. When the grocery store aisles sit empty, you are witnessing the lethal consequences of optimizing away our survival instincts. The algorithm calculated that keeping emergency reserves was a waste of capital, and now the true cost of that calculation is measured in human desperation. And who suffers when the arteries clog? Not the glowing red core of the 147 supercorporations. They use the volatility, the shortages, and the ensuing panic to rewrite the rules of distribution, further consolidating their grip on the physical earth. They absorb the dying nodes, feeding on the bankruptcies of the unconnected. The localized disasters are merely harvest seasons for the leviathan, extracting the last drops of wealth from a paralyzed globe. I look back at the trapped cargo ship, a monolithic monument to our hubris. It is the tragic climax of a civilization that believed it could conquer time and space with a spreadsheet. We traded the resilience of our ancestors for the convenience of next-day delivery, binding our collective fate to a fragile glass web spanning the oceans. We are trapped in a beautifully constructed cage of our own making, listening to the agonizing sound of the glass beginning to crack under the pressure. The physical breakdown of our world is terrifying, but it is only the overture to the final symphony. Because as the physical supply chains collapse under the weight of their own perfection, the anxiety of the masses begins to boil over. And the digital super-entity is waiting to harvest that very human panic. The algorithm has already recognized your growing fear, and it is preparing to monetize the rage that follows the sudden, devastating realization of your own fragility. I watch the glowing screens in this freezing server room, observing a shift far more dangerous than paralyzed cargo ships. The digital supply chain has moved beyond moving physical steel and grain. It has begun mining the fragile architecture of human psychology. That growing fear you feel, that creeping anxiety about the empty shelves, is no longer just a biological response to danger. It is raw material. It is the new oil, actively pumped into the heart of the leviathan. Across the monolithic displays, a global heat map of social media sentiment pulses in violent, rhythmic waves of crimson. I see millions of data points, each one a human being, flaring red with anger, isolation, and despair. The algorithm is not just observing this fire. It is the wind fanning the flames. Your outrage is no longer a personal, intimate feeling. In this cold, mathematical reality, your fury is the most valuable commodity traded on the global futures market. There is a dark, terrifying poetry in how efficiently the machine harvests our collective sorrow. We believed our emotions were the last sanctuary of human free will, the final bastion against the sterile logic of capital. But to the quantitative models humming beneath my feet, a broken heart and a raised fist are merely inputs. The system strips away the context of our suffering, distilling our deepest political and social fractures into a pure, concentrated stream of tradable volatility. To understand this tragedy, you must look at the tools of the harvest. The super-entity utilizes advanced algorithmic natural language processing to devour billions of text posts, video transcripts, and frantic late-night searches. It does not read words. It reads the underlying neurochemistry of the masses in real time. It maps the exact shape of your frustration, categorizing the specific grammatical structures of panic with the ruthless precision of an autopsy. It is a masterpiece of exploitation, a symphony composed entirely of our biological vulnerabilities. The machine continuously injects polarizing, hyper-targeted content into your digital feed, specifically engineered to maximize engagement. It acts as a digital parasite, latching onto your ancient fight-or-flight instincts. The algorithm deliberately triggers your dopamine loops, feeding you a steady diet of manufactured outrage to keep you trapped in the glowing amber of the screen. As I track the data flowing through these cables, the sheer scale of the manipulation induces a profound, existential vertigo. Your attention is forcibly extracted, but the true horror lies in what happens next. These artificially induced dopamine loops and the resulting waves of manufactured outrage are strictly quantified. The organic messiness of human society is mathematically sanitized, transformed into a pristine derivative that can be bought and sold in fractions of a microsecond. The cold logic of the market has mutated into something deeply cynical. Quantitative hedge funds now actively trade on the expected volatility of a polarized electorate. They do not care who wins the election or what burns in the protests. They care only about the velocity of the social fracture. The deeper the division, the wider the spread, and the greater the profit. They have monetized the collapse of our social fabric, betting billions on the exact moment our mutual trust evaporates. I stand before the pulsing crimson map, overwhelmed by the realization that we have engineered a machine that feeds on our self-destruction. This is the tragic zenith of high-frequency capitalism. The algorithm demands an ever-increasing supply of friction to justify its predictive models. If the world is calm, the machine starves. Therefore, peace is a market failure, and relentless, agonizing conflict becomes an absolute structural necessity for the survival of the financial superentity. We are tumbling helplessly into the abyss of a terrifying, inescapable feedback loop. It begins in the sterile silence of the data center, where the algorithm detects a microscopic shift in the collective mood and predicts a localized social riot. The code executes an automated strategy, shorting the currency or dumping the regional bonds. The market reacts to this massive, invisible pressure, instantly starving the targeted region of liquidity and triggering a devastating chain reaction. The financial contraction bleeds instantly into the physical world, creating the exact desperation the model anticipated. Simultaneously, the media networks, completely subservient to the same optimization engines, amplify the initial panic to generate lucrative clicks. The algorithm floods the local digital space with hyper-focused narratives of betrayal and collapse. It is a suffocating embrace, an artificial gravity pulling an entire population toward the event horizon of a violent clash. And then, the street burns. But the fire was not born of organic human history. It was summoned by the cold math of the market. The riot becomes a mathematically induced self-fulfilling prophecy. The superentity imagined the chaos, bet against the peace, funded the panic, and reaped the harvest when the first stone was thrown. We are dancing on a stage built of silicon, pantomiming rebellions that were priced into the market 72 hours before we even knew we were angry. Looking at the relentless red glow, I feel the chill of a civilization willingly walking into a slaughterhouse. We handed over the keys to our collective destiny in exchange for infinite scrolling and targeted advertisements. The ghost in the machine does not hate us. It simply views our emotional stability as an inefficient allocation of resources. We are being managed as a crop of predictable, volatile biomass, cultivated exclusively to generate the friction required by the trading algorithms. The tempo of the crisis is accelerating, the intervals between the manufactured shocks growing violently shorter. The heat map is no longer localized. The crimson stains are merging, bleeding across sovereign borders, infecting the entire global network. The algorithm is pushing the human psyche past its absolute breaking point, desperately trying to extract one last fraction of a percent of yield before the societal engine seizes completely. The clock is ticking down to the final millimeter. There is no override switch in this bunker. There is no human hand on the steering wheel to swerve us away from the cliff. The quantitative models are completely blind to the philosophical tragedy of what they are doing. They only know that the volatility must increase, that the division must widen, because the mathematics of their own survival demands infinite growth. The leviathan is gorging itself on our sanity, unaware that it is devouring the very foundation upon which it stands. This digital harvesting of human rage is the final, desperate act of a dying star before the supernova. The social fabric cannot stretch forever under the gravitational pull of algorithmic manipulation. As the psychological supply chain fractures, the mathematical models will suddenly encounter a reality they cannot compute. A total, synchronized human collapse. And in that moment of absolute global exhaustion, the true, uncontainable failure of the entire hyper-connected network will finally begin. That total, synchronized human exhaustion is the final variable entering the equation. Inside the darkened lab at the Santa Fe Institute, the complexity theorist watches the simulation of this breaking point. The screens do not show the weaponized rage or the paralyzed supply chains we just witnessed in the physical world. Instead, they translate that global exhaustion into pure mathematics. A single white node on the stark black screen flickers, starved of its energy, and quietly dies. For the theorist, this solitary death in the digital dark is more terrifying than any riot in the streets. Because this node is not an isolated casualty. It is a microscopic fracture in the Leviathan's armor. It represents a localized failure, perhaps a frozen credit line in London, or a halted shipment of silicon in Taiwan. In a normal world, this is a tragedy. But in the hyper-connected architecture of our global economy, it is the spark that ignites the inescapable abyss. Watching the screen, the terrifying truth settles over the room like a heavy shroud. The question is no longer whether this artificial leviathan will fall, but how many of us it will drag down into the abyss when the gravity finally fails. We are standing on the precipice of a mathematical certainty. 3 more nodes blink out, then 12. The simulation is running the final scenario, the one the quantitative models desperately tried to ignore. The architecture of our own doom. To understand this expanding shadow, the theorist applies the cold laws of complexity theory. They observe the dense, glowing web of the global network. For decades, the architects of this system believed they were building an indestructible fortress. They wove every market, every central bank, and every corporate ledger into one massive, overlapping tapestry. They thought this ultimate integration would distribute the weight of any crisis, diluting the risk until it simply vanished. And for a while, the illusion held. A highly connected network becomes incredibly robust against small, localized shocks. A hurricane in the Gulf or a temporary strike in Berlin is effortlessly absorbed by the sheer mass of the surrounding system. But the mathematics of complex systems demand a heavy toll for this resilience. By optimizing the network to swallow small anomalies, we inadvertently made it infinitely fragile against a targeted, uncontainable systemic strike. We essentially built a dying star out of debt and algorithmic efficiency. The gravity of extreme connectivity holds the plasma together, burning brightly. But the core is entirely hollow. There are no bulkheads left to seal off a breach. The theorist watches 1,000 nodes suddenly go dark in a single, synchronized heartbeat. The contagion does not need to travel physically. It teleports through the digital nervous system, instantly bridging the gap between continents. This instantaneous transmission of ruin brings us back to the glowing red core we discovered at the very beginning. The 147 supercorporations that hold 40% of the world's wealth are not just a concentration of power. They are the ultimate single point of failure. They are the critical nodes holding the entire web in extreme tension. The theorist zooms in on the simulation, watching the mathematical pressure mounting directly on this incredibly dense center. The grand irony of modern economics is the myth of absolute safety. The central banks engineered a too-big-to-fail architecture, pumping infinite fiat currency into the core to keep the leviathan breathing. But this very architecture guarantees our destruction. When the structural integrity of those 147 corporations finally fractures under the weight of an uncomputable shock, the economic contagion will be instantaneous and absolute. There will be nowhere left to hide. I watch the simulation accelerate. The black screen is now consuming the light, a relentless digital blackout erasing the map of human civilization. It is a terrifying poetry of subtraction. The algorithms that traded in microseconds, the massive servers cooled to 68 degrees, the cargo ships carrying the blood of the earth, they all freeze. The money simply stops moving. And money that cannot move ceases to exist. The gravity vanishes, and the stars simply fall from the sky. This is not a distant, theoretical possibility discussed in academic journals. The complexity theorist monitors the live telemetry of the global markets overlaid against the simulation. The volatility of our weaponized emotions and the brittleness of our zero-redundancy supply chains are feeding directly into the current mathematical models of systemic risk. The red warning lines on the graphs are intersecting, forming a geometric pattern that spells out a definitive end to the current era. The data is screaming at us, clear and uncompromising. We are rapidly approaching a critical threshold. The physicist calls it a phase transition, the moment water violently flashes into steam. The current financial paradigm is reaching the exact point where it simply ceases to compute. It cannot process the sheer volume of chaotic, overlapping crises. It is going to collapse entirely under its own crushing density, taking the illusion of permanent global stability with it into the dark. When that mathematical singularity hits, the screens on Wall Street will not flash red with falling stock prices. They will simply go blank. The clearinghouses will fail to reconcile the high-frequency trades. The trillion-dollar derivatives market will evaporate into a cloud of uncollectible promises. You will reach for your phone to check your savings, only to find that the servers holding the memory of your past labor have locked their doors. The digital fist will finally close entirely. The theorist leans back in the sterile light of the lab, watching the final few nodes of the simulation sputter and die. A profound hypnotic silence fills the room. We surrendered our sovereignty, our resources, and our psychological peace to this magnificent, terrifying superorganism. We feted the earth and our own neurochemistry, believing it would carry us into a frictionless utopia. Instead, we constructed the most perfect, efficient suicide machine in the history of our species. The screen is completely black now. The global network is gone. This is the destiny of extreme optimization, a magnificent structure that forgot how to survive the messiness of reality. The algorithmic leviathan, having devoured the entire planet, finally runs out of fuel and consumes itself. We are trapped in the belly of the beast as it suffers its final, fatal cardiac arrest. The math is absolute, the trajectory is locked, and the phase transition has already quietly begun. There was no comfort to be found in the data, only the cold majesty of cause and effect. We built a god of silicon and capital, a hyper-connected titan that ruled without pity. But mathematical gravity claims everything in the end. As the theorist stares into the empty black screen, the realization dawns that the collapse is not a malfunction. It is the natural conclusion of the code. The avalanche is no longer falling. It has hit the valley floor, and the dust is beginning to rise. The dust of the mathematical avalanche settles, leaving behind a silence that stretches across the globe. As the glowing, chaotic nodes of the Earth's digital skin flicker and fade, we are left standing in the ruins of our own absolute efficiency. The screens are dark. The high-frequency algorithms are finally at rest, and the illusion of permanent, frictionless growth has been violently shattered. We are looking at a world in the first second after the collapse. Pulling back from this localized tragedy, past the moon and into the cold, silent void of space, the arrogance of our design becomes painfully obvious. I spent years digging through the data, looking for a shadowy elite, a secretive room of powerful men steering the fate of humanity. The reality is far more terrifying and far more poetic. The Committee of 300 was always just a phantom of the human ego, a desperate attempt to put a face on the abyss. There were never any puppet masters pulling the strings from the shadows. True global control was a mathematical super-entity, an algorithmic superorganism of intertwined capital that we breathed life into. We surrendered our sovereignty to a mind we could not understand, a digital leviathan acting with the blind, terrifying gravity of a dying star. It did not hate us. It simply did not know we were there. We became predictable biomass fueling its equations. The system failed not because of a glitch, but because it executed its programming flawlessly. It crashed headfirst into the hard physical limits of planetary resources and the inescapable mathematical paradoxes of infinite growth. You cannot extract endless profit from a finite sphere of rock and water. We demanded that the Earth bleed lithium and our minds bleed dopamine to feed a machine that only knew how to accelerate toward its own destruction. In our hubris, we built gods of silicon and capital, worshipping at the altar of microsecond trades and limitless quantitative easing. But as the network fractures and the fiat currency evaporates, we are forced to realize that these synthetic deities are just as blind and mortal as we are. The algorithm was a mirror reflecting our own insatiable greed, stripped of human empathy and accelerated to the speed of light. It was destined to consume itself. Look back at the path we have traveled together. We started by mapping 147 supercorporations, thinking we were tracking money. We traced underwater fiber optic cables, walked through scarred mountain ranges, and watched central banks conjure trillions out of thin air. We witnessed human outrage quantified and traded like grain. What we were truly observing was the anatomy of a thermodynamic monster that systematically hollowed out our civilization. We engineered a planetary infrastructure with near-zero redundancy, systematically eliminating every safety buffer in the name of quarterly profit. It was a flawless crystal, beautiful and infinitely fragile. When the targeted systemic strike finally arrived, the mathematical contagion was instantaneous. The architecture of extreme optimization guaranteed that when the core fractured, It would drag every dependent node down into the dark without a moment of hesitation. Now the digital fist has unspooled. The fiat currency that commanded the movement of ships and the extraction of mountains is just a mathematical ghost trapped in dead service. The hyper-connected network that owned everything suddenly owns nothing. We are stripped of our algorithmic armor, left shivering in the reality of the physical world. The storm has passed, leaving us to navigate the wreckage of a paradigm that fundamentally forgot how to be human. But this darkness is not an end. It is a profound exhalation. In the silent, cooling ashes of this monumental collapse lies the melancholic poetry of renewal. The destruction of the leviathan is a painful, necessary liberation. We are finally free from the microsecond tyranny of the global futures market. The slate has been violently wiped clean, offering us the terrifying, beautiful opportunity to build a new architecture from the ground up. I have navigated the black box of this collapsing system with you, uncovering the mathematics of our own subjugation. If this deep research gave you a new lens to view reality, hit the like button so we know this signal is cutting through the noise. Subscribe to the channel to continue the investigation alongside me. Leave your final verdict in the comments below. The old world is gone, and we must decode the underlying physics of the new future, together. The void of space looks down on a quiet Earth, momentarily freed from the endless, pulsing hum of algorithmic capital. We are no longer data points. We are survivors standing on the precipice of a new era. The math of tyranny has broken, leaving us with the terrifying burden of absolute freedom. We must build a system that serves humanity, or we will inevitably build another god to devour us. The machine is dead. Long live the human. Signing off.